to question. Okay. So, but let's go on. Well, first of all, it should be stressed, while I'm from France and working, and I will mostly speak about the evidence in France and of course Normandy, which will be one of the most successful area of where Scandinavian had settled, and which had no great expansion, be it by the ears as William the Conqueror and also in Sicilia and so on. But nevertheless, one can see very often in the research, in the archaeological research anyhow, we will say, even if you know that French is neither French nor German, and this should really be stressed because it gives quite other way to look also. And the way that people can say it, but actually they will act otherwise and very much respect the actual frontiers, can be seen of those. The first is a catalogue of an exposition, Les Vikings dans l'Empire franc. It is said l'Empire franc, but actually it is nearly only speaking about France, except to contribution from historians who are more used to, and that is of course also a question about the nature of evidence, to cross and look more in the old area of frontier and not to follow the actual frontiers. The other is scientific publication, more which has more contribution, more scholars, which is Die Wikinger und das Frankische Reich, where it would be very German. And outside the fact that most of the articles are in German, but they would solicitate not one single French scholar is there, and the same can be seen on the other way, but both are speaking about Frankish area, and they will miss the other part. And now I will also do it a bit, but I know it, well, I would stress it. So to begin, I will say about what do we know and how do we mostly work about it, on it. And there you have an inventory which has been made and published in the catalog that I just showed in the present, in the former slides. I'm sorry for my English. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of points near the Seine Valley, but actually it is a very tiny evidence when you are comparing to the written evidence and also the linguistic heritage. But let's have, however, a bit of a look of what it is. Many cases it will be weapons who are, and isolated discoveries, where the weapons found in the rivers, things which has also been noted in the Netherlands and in the Rhine area and the Meuse, where it has been found in that water found objects are rather typical for these types of discoveries. This is 2 points we can take. One is the nature, weapons. The other is the place where it has been discovered. But weapons are also a very shared object. So many of these points we can see may be reduced even more. I'll come back to it because they are chronological dating from the time of the Viking raids the 9th and 10th century, but many of them could as well have been used by a Frankish warrior. Here in those cases, you have a typically weapon axe and also a decoration of the sword, which is of more Scandinavian type. But it is actually not the most current case. There are also some other finds, such as burials. One of the oldest ones have been found in Pitre in the 19th century. So it's very old, and we just only know that it has been found near the church, which may be more recent, but that was a place. Pitre is, by the way, a very important place because you have later on also a bridge was built and should be defensive against the Scandinavians. And you also have a very famous written source, the Edit de Pitre, which has been made in 1864. But so the place is rather important. Nevertheless, there you have real evidence, peoples, which indicates that it was a female who had it. There are also other burials, but they are not, or they had been seriously questioned, notably Reveal in Normandy, Western Normandy, and the ceramics and even revision by Cyril Marcini made it more probably to be a site from the Bronze Age. So goodbye to this place. Another place, which is more sure, that's not in Normandy, but in Brittany, where Ile-de-Roi in southern Brittany, where there is a ship grave, and there you have both the occurrence of a typical, or this is clearly Scandinavian. But what is quite interesting is that this is also rather late. The Scandinavians or the Nordic peoples were chased from Britain in 1936 by Alain Barbetot, and this grave is more decades later. So there must be some, perhaps still some settlers living in Scandinavian cultures, but who have escaped to written evidence. It seems less probably that it should just have been one who is buried there and then you go on, because if you do that, the risk of violation of the tomb is very great. And we have other evidence also in Scandinavian archaeology about how you had brought the corpses with you to interring them at home when they came from an elite. So it is a puzzling problem. But it was unfortunately found very soon, and most of it has gone away. And for the study, the most performative study, most serious studies will still be that one of the German archaeologist Michael Müller-Wiele, who is know very well the Scandinavian culture. And there you have a problem which I said before, that is the sword and its decoration in mammoth style. The animal style is clearly Scandinavian. But then some, also the latest research who had been made of Ile-de-Roi by French scholars will say the embow from the shield should also, shield bosses would also be Scandinavian. But that we cannot say, because they are also typified on Frankish shields. But we have another evidence, because you do not put furniture in Carolingian graves, what you do in the Nordic graves. Some other places have been found. I will not detail them too much because I would like to go more to see a larger perspective. There has been found in Taillebourg, Port d'Envaux, where I had made the first expertise, but which I immediately also will confirm me with Scandinavian working in Scandinavia, because they are working a lot and the science is going so fast. And very often, if you do not do that, you will be obsolete. But there are some things which are rather typically Scandinavian, so as the weapon axes. And then you had those curious lead features, but Scandinavian archaeologists were asked, as Ole Krumlin Pedersen did, think it was, or was very interested. But it is unique and we do not know too much what it is. You can also see a silver ring. As to make it fit with the historical contents, I searched a lot for parallels from 9th century, but this was not, I did not really succeed. It was in 10th century. And Else Rosdahl told me, also confirmed, that the axe was rather late. So it's a bit like the ship grave in Ile-de-Groix. It is puzzling late. So that just leaves us with more question about what it can be. Perhaps some trading, because you have also an Anglo-Saxon way here. I do not know, no, you probably cannot see. So if I want to point on, can. So there it is. But as I said, formally, are all those objects really Scandinavian? Some of them are, but many of them do not need to be it. So the evidence may be even more tiny, even if you have those who had come fortunately, as in Taillebourg, in the valley of Charente, or if it has in the same valley, it was they have subaquatic analysis, or sometimes with metal detector finds. Some recent discoveries, notably 2 axes of Thor, found in the same valley in 2 different localities, which may be some interesting hints. And most interesting, perhaps even more interesting, studied a little treasure about with mints, which are not Frankish and which has been treated in a Scandinavian way. That is the silver, which is important, and not the coin. So that is actually not the nature of the objects, but the way to treat them, who would give the Scandinavian attribution suggested by Jens Christian Moesgaard. And that is certainly a rather important point to recall. We have here clearly a bias, because metal detectors are a very great problem. Some countries, such as Denmark, had succeeded to make a coexistence and even very fruitful and collaboration with metal detector. On the other side of the channel, that is in United Kingdoms, there is the portable antiquities schema, which have given lots of new finds, but it is not as positive, however, as it may be in Scandinavia. And anyhow, it is necessary that you have very many archaeologists who can really got the time and the possibility to collaborate with peoples. That is not the case in France. So that is why also French authorities will be very, very skeptical about using metal detectors, because it would be, and it is, a catastrophe to us. And sometimes we may also have some of perhaps hysterical attitude to it, but it is comprehensive because we cannot cope with it. And there are a lot of things who have been destroyed. Just as I also had heard that the British soil is getting less and less rich in metal finds because there have been so many peoples. So that's quite a problem. But if we look at the nature, even if there has come some of those more finds, they will be either very Scandinavian or a way to treat them in a Scandinavian manner. But you do not have something which shows that there has been a cultural interaction about some symbols and material culture. I'll come back to this more in detail later. So what do we have? Well, there's the traditional linguistic heritage which had been put forward, and where you can see here the most dark areas are where the place names would be the most obvious and the most densely. And where the Seine Valley is very good represented, you also have some names. So all the names, Norman names, which is ending on to, came from Toft, which you also have in England, by the way, but which is the enclosure in the rural settlements in Denmark and in Sweden, and which also have an importance to the fiscality. That's another story. So some archaeologists have chosen to look at place names, such as Jacques Lemeau, who had pointed out that many places near the river where you may have some landing places, more of them have Scandinavian names, and seems so to be shows us about a way to use the waterways, and probably also for trading places and things like that, just as we can know it from other areas, notably in Denmark, but not only. I think an even more interesting way, and I said it a bit, that is when you look at the countryside that you have in the small place names and microtoponyms, and there you have quite a lot of Nordic words. As you can see here, one excavation near Caen, Mondeville, I had put it in italic. Mond derives from the Scandinavian man's name Amund, and Del is a part, which you also can find in the Jutland law. Musset thought that it was Anglo-Scandinavian, but linguistic, or the word, we have no reason to say that. It can be it, but it can also be really Dane. So nevertheless, the excavation which had been there in Mondeville had not showed up the least occurrence of Scandinavian people, nothing. On the other hand, they found a mint which had been made in Lisieux in Normandy in the middle 9th century, when the rating was as it highest. So there you have all the paradox. The name of the man who had the villa, that's a hybrid, is Danish, but the material culture is very, very Frankish and Carolingian. Then you can have some other more discrete ones, or the passage. You have this funny thing, which is on a wetland out in a Carolingian village in La Grande Paroisse, where it could be the ship with some shields. So perhaps someone had seen it or had just spoken about it and made it. But it still will be not Scandinavian. And then you have places which have been heavily destructed. Rouen, the cathedral at Rouen, which was also deserted, abandoned for more decades, just as the monasteries in Brittany, in Landévennec, which you have here, and you can see how tree was growing. So destruction who lasted for more decades. People did not come. But sometimes you can also have, in other cases, the fire can also be a cook who is not very good or things like that. It can be a lot of things. And Frankish people were also rather violent sometimes. So it is not, we cannot just say fire equal to Vikings. There must be a quite complicated argumentation to it. Nevertheless, we have some reactions we know about. For instance, in Saint-Denis, which is a suburb now to Paris, there has been excavated and known that we know that Charles the Bald did fortify the monastic town after a Viking raid. So, and it has been excavated. It is from the middle or second half of the 9th century. It is of the time of Charles the Bald. So there we can see, and other sources shows that it was to defend and has been built. We can also, if in the Loire Valley, a town as Tours has got a very awkward evolution because it has been attacked by Scandinavians. And then the big monastery at Saint-Martin did fortified itself afterwards. Of course, we can say now that they did not return, so perhaps it was usual. Nevertheless, the monastery thought that they should defend themselves, so they had the new castle Châteauneuf, where you have some occurrence here and there in the town, and which make that you have the ancient city at the east, and in the west you have the monastic suburb, two independent and fortified town communities, which were only unified in the 100 Years' War. So there has been quite a access. What is also interesting, that is that the Viking attacks were used by the religious of Saint-Martin to get out more earth, because they argued to the royal authorities that they had suffered and they needed to organize their properties otherwise. Of course, that's from the written evidence, but it shows that there had been arguments, just as we should not forget that the end of the Carolingian dynasty, which goes on longer in the western part of Francia, is also due to the Viking attack in Paris, where it was the Count Eudes, which the family of the Robert-le-Fort and then the Capetians. So there was political consequences about the way to cope with Scandinavian, which was rather thoroughgoing. Let's now turn the other way, because we can see little evidence, but perhaps even the most important evidence from written sources and from the tiny archaeological evidence would be hints about how to react and what should we do afterwards, and perhaps also how shall we manage land, be we Scandinavian, Anglo-Scandinavian or Frankish people in the settled area. One thing I said first, that the French are neither Germany and neither France. And at the same time, we should also consider the regional differences. And it is, as a matter of fact, quite funny that you have more finds in Brittany, which was less Viking, than in Normandy. Just as in other way of the material cultures, there are great differences also in the northern Western Francia, to be Northwest French. The same is also the case of Scandinavia. We cannot just, as we often do, just say Scandinavians. Sweden, Danes, and Norwegians are not having exactly, they have a lot of things to common. The languages are quite similar, but they have also important regional differences, just as they also can observe it within the different Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish regions. And this regional diversity, we cannot ignore it, but because it might have quite a lot of consequences for how you settled and what were the interactions and what did happen before. So if we look the other way around, there we can see where did the Frankish go. Let's begin with then the Eastern Frisian. And I can see that I already spoken a lot too much, so I will speed up. So you have there founds of part of ceramics. It is quite interesting to see that you find it only in the urban centers, the towns, emporia, or only in Jutland. You will also have in the region of Libre these places in some rural settlements. What is also very important here, that's the fact that this chronological context is actually before the Vikings, or it is in the 8th century. And then when we see archaeological evidence, the Frankish written says they did not at all mention Scandinavia. You have Grégoire de Tours, who mentions an unlucky Danish king, Clodolicus, who failed a raid in the 6th century, and then it's just silence. They do not exist, but archaeology shows that they had traded together and there has been a lot of contact, but it was only exchange, and that is not as interesting to write about. So that certainly explains quite a lot. Well, these things I can show, that is now there is context. You can see it was the siege, mostly from 8th century, so before the classical Viking period, but archaeological, I would argue that we should put it more decades before, and also importation of Frankish querns, millstones made in Frankish area. So they had to deal together. That is quite obviously. And this has also influenced the Danish elites, so as some shirts may probably had been minted by some royal authority in Ribe and later on been imitated. The tricky way of archaeological diffused artifact is that the diffusion do not necessarily shows who you are. For instance, those Ulfbird swords, very known, some even say that they are Viking. No, they are not. You have found them in the Scandinavian area because they put weapon in some tombs. But Ulfbird, you have cross on it, and it is clearly a Frankish production. This does, of course, not exclude that they have been imitated, but they are made in Frankish area, and many of them probably in monasteries. That's also another thing. We should not, monasteries are not just praying monks. They are making and selling arms. They are also selling a lot of other things which probably also explains why they were targets for raiding. Not that they were more pacific, that would be rather naive to think, but because they were the economic trading places that many may already had known. That could be very well the case of Saint-Denis. The culture among the elites, we can here have an example there from Charles the Bald, a very famous Bible, where you can see here the sword belt set you have, which you will find in Scandinavia also. This has been found in Scandinavia, in a Scandinavian treasure. What is quite funny that it would be imitated and it would be used to the women dress. But the influence is there, and you can see it would be mostly at first in southern Scandinavian and some Swedish parts, but you have clearly a contact which points to repeatedly contact and also use of Frankish prestige in conspicuous display in the Scandinavian area, and especially in the southern Scandinavian one, were mostly, notably the Danes. This can also be seen that Carolingian coins will be imitated and will influence the way that you make coins as king in southern Scandinavia. And now I would just go, well, that's what we can see in the both way. But what if we compare to other places? That's what was my other points. And let's just look on the other side of the channel, where there are a lot of finds with the portable antique scheme. Of course, there will be even more, but you still have had more finds. But as in France, we should also be aware, when you're speaking about Viking York, most of the archaeological remnants are Anglo-Saxon and not Viking or Scandinavian, but we just extrapolate and call it all Vikings. But what we have here, that is another thing. It's not only a question of quantity, but also of quality. And I think that that's a point we should, the clue we should really stress. And we have in the insular area, we will have hybrid styles, which you do not at all find in the Frankish area. There may be one example, as far as I have seen, in a Dorestad of our hair needle, but it is so little compared to all those hybrid and Anglo-Scandinavian style, which you will not find in Scandinavia, but which are adapting and using the Scandinavian influence in a new style. And that you do not at all have in Normandy. When you have it in the 12th century, it is not because of the Normans or the Vikings, but because of the Anglo-Norman context. So that's because England had become Norman. But and then you have those funny things. So to understand that, I think we should go back to times, and I shall hurry more up. We can have a similar, we can contrast to see research, because very often we only are looking about Vikings when they enter into the international scene, but they came also from their own background, and we should see what happened before. If we go back to the migration period, we have those animal styles, notably the Salin one, where Lotte Hither had pointed out that the diffusion of those animal styles felt together in the continent with many of the areas where people reclaimed a Scandinavian connection and even origin. It is certainly not right. It is not possible. They could not have born so many people, but it's a question about contact and influence and what you do. But if you look at the card, you can see, and the goal, you have nothing. It's like you really have a reflections of it. And when you see also when the Frankish people told about their origins compared to the Goths, who said that they were staying from Odin or Freya and things like that, and from Scandinavia sometimes, also the Lombard, the Frankish ones, they come from Troia. They were in a classical tradition. Well, both origin myths are certainly not true, but it is interesting to see the model and the fusion. And you can see the same way also how you will only have in the Eastern Frankish areas some diffusion of significance of those other animal styles, Southern too. What did people think about it? You have Boniface, who was an Anglo-Saxon. He was, I had not translated that, sorry, but it's in Latin, most of it. He was missionary in Germany and of the Frisian. And he spoke about the horrible dress accessories with worms and other things, and it is just Antichrist. So there you can see that's quite revolting. Of course, you cannot accept such a thing. So you may also have had some religious attitude behind. that does not mean that the animal styles are necessarily all pagan ones. It certainly is not when you're going into the Anglo-Saxon England and Northern Lombard context, but they probably were used in the symbols, in the pagan way of display. When you compare the different variations of animal styles, you will see it's much more complicated when you are in the Scandinavian area and a bit in some Anglo-Saxon areas. But all the others, it is very simple compared to the great complexity which I do not have the time to go on. So there might be a way to, what are we using? Actually, it is animal styles and such a sort of things which make it possible to identify Scandinavians. But we can see in the former centuries, this has no success at all in Frankish area, in almost the end worst. How do we then see, if we go back to again, the different constructions of the past and memories of the past? The Normans do remember that they are Normans, but it is rather symbolic. When Dudon de Saint-Quentin, the oldest chronicle, relating the origin of the Danes, he'll say that they are coming from Troia, just as the Frankish one. Saxo, in the beginning of the 13th century, in his prologue, he say, Dudu is wrong. It is rather funny that the medieval chronicler says that. He say, he do not think that he's right there. The Danes are coming from a King Dane. But anyhow, he will not say Odin because he's writing for the Christian people in the continent. So that would not be clever. It's not like the sagas where they can tell what they want because they are in Nordic language. And how were the Frankish? Well, we know that the first, even in the late 10th century, you sent the duke's sons to Bayeux and even to learn Danish. So you must have had people who spoke Danish. But does the fact that you learn to speak Danish mean that you want to be Danish? If you go to the beginning of the 11th century, it's quite interesting to see that Knut the Great, the Danish king who conquered England, first he married Emma, who was from the Norman ducal family. The Norman ducal family did not like that at all. And he also tried to marry his sister to the Norman Duke, who didn't want her. So clearly they did not want to be allied with the Danes. They looked towards the Franks. And when we so often cite the Bayeux embroidery, but actually they are not putting on that we are Norman. They said, we are Frankish, hic Franci pugnant. So it is a clear volunteer to be very Frankish. By the way, one of a German history, Karl Werner, did qualify the Norman as the best pupils of the Franks. So there may be some evidence, and perhaps the fact that you should learn to speak Danish may mean that you had Danish-speaking population, but it was integration, and the elite and the leading people clearly wanted to integrate the Frankish culture. So after all, it is rather logic that we could not find a lot of animal style, which often will be related to display of identity when it is of fine quality. No, they would do as Frankish elite does. So to conclude, the archaeological evidence in Frankish area, and not only in France, is very discreet. This is very interesting, I think, because it contrasts to the written and linguistic sources and reactions of the Frankish society that contrast so much with the tiny material evidence. This is a channel for research and the understanding of our criterions to identify the Scandinavian settlers. So we should consider better the cultural interaction and the reception of symbols, which will sometimes say that it is not very, archaeology may not be the best mean to find out about Scandinavian settling. We must certainly most rely on written sources, linguistic evidence. Now, of course, but it is less developed for the moment in France. Perhaps that all those stories about genomes and things like that would throw other lights on it. But we cannot use the traditional typological way which suggests the people to make pleasure for future archaeological would leave their marks. The material culture was part of the past, the present in the past, and not for us. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry to be so long.